Chapter 6 Under the Little Hills. Summer, which follows spring so closely that the two are almost one, was upon us before it was possible to travel to the shores of Utek's lake and meet the people. I had arranged for Franz to take me there, while Hans and the children were to remain at Windy Bay to feed the dogs we left behind, and to care for the camp. As Franz and I prepared for the journey north, I was excited and at the same time depressed. Much as I wished to meet the Ihalmuit in their own land, the fragmentary glimpses of their lives that I had from Franz had left me with a strong feeling of unease at the prospect of meeting them face to face. I wondered if they would have any conception as to how much of their tragedy they owed to men of my color, and I wondered if, like the northern Indians, they would be a morose and sullen lot, resentful of my presence, suspicious and uncommunicative. Even if they welcomed me into their homes, I was still afraid of my own reactions. The prospect of seeing and living with a people who knew starvation as intimately as I knew plenty, the idea of seeing with my own eyes this disintegrating remnant of a dying race, left me with a sensation closely akin to fear. We could not make the journey northward by canoe, for the raging streams which had cut across the Barrens only a few weeks before were now reduced to tiny creeks whose courses were interrupted by jumbled barriers of rock. No major rivers flowed the way we wished to go, and so the water routes were useless to us. Since the only alternative was a trek overland, we prepared to go on foot, as the Ihalmuit do. But there was a difference. The Ihalmuit travel light, and a man of the people crossing the open plains in summer carries little more than his knife, a pipe, and perhaps a spare pair of skin boots called kamek. He eats when he finds something to eat. There are usually suckers in the shrunken streams, and these can sometimes be caught with the hands. Or if the suckers are too hard to find, the traveler can take a length of rawhide line and snare the orange-colored ground squirrels on the sandy esker slopes. In early summer there are always eggs, or flightless birds, and if the eggs are nearly at the hatching point, so much the better. Franz and I, on the other hand, traveled in white man style. We were accompanied by 5 dogs, and to each dog we fastened a miniature Indian travois, 2 long, thin poles that stretched behind to support a foot-square platform on which we could load nearly 30 pounds of gear that included bedrolls, ammunition, cooking tools, and presents of flour and tobacco for the Eskimos. With this equipment we were also able to carry a little tent, and food for the dogs and ourselves, deer meat for them, and flour and tea and baking powder for us. We had more than the bare essentials, but we had to pay a stiff price for them. Equipped with pack dogs, it took us better than a week to cover the same 60 miles the Ihalmuit crossed in 2 days and a night. I shall not soon forget the tortures of that march. While the sun shone, the heat was as intense as it is in the tropics, for the clarity of the Arctic air does nothing to soften the sun's rays. Yet we were forced to wear sweaters and even caribou skin jackets. The flies did that to us. They rose from the lichens at our feet until they hung like a malevolent mist about us and took on the appearance of a low-lying cloud. Melugia, black flies, and Kiktoriak, mosquitoes, came in such numbers that their presence actually gave me a feeling of physical terror. There was simply no evading them. The bleak barrens stretched into emptiness on every side and offered no escape or succors. To stop for food was torture, and to continue to march in the overwhelming summer heat was worse. At times a kind of insanity would seize us, and we would drop everything and run wildly in any direction until we were exhausted. But the pursuing horde stayed with us, and we got nothing for our frantic efforts except a wave of sweat that seemed to attract even more of the mosquitoes. From behind our ears, from beneath our chins, a steady dribble of blood matted into our clothing and trapped the insatiable flies until we both wore black collars composed of their struggling bodies. The flies worked down under our shirts until our belts stopped them. Then they fed about our waists until the clothing stuck to us like us with drying blood. The land we were passing over offered no easy routes to compensate for the agonies of the flies inflicted upon us. It was rolling country, and across our path ran a succession of mounding hills whose sides and crests were strewn with angular rocks and with broken fragments, filling the interstices between the bigger boulders. On these our boots were cut and split, and our feet bruised until it was agony to walk at all. But at that the hills were better walking than the broad, wet valleys which lay in between. Each valley had its own stream flowing down its center, though those streams were often less than 5 feet in width. They seemed to be never less than 5 feet deep. The valley floors were one continuous mattress of wet moss into which we sank up to our knees until our feet found the perpetual ice that lay beneath. Wading and stumbling through the icy water of these muskegs, floundering across streams or around the countless ponds, all of whose banks were undercut and offered no gradual descent, we would become numbed from the waist down until our upper bodies were bathed in sweat. If, as happened for 3 solid days, it rained, then we lived a sodden nightmare as we crossed those endless bogs. I am not detailing the conditions of summer travel in order to emphasize my own discomforts, but to illustrate the perfectly amazing capacity of the Ihalmuit as travelers. Over 60 miles of such country, the people could move with ease, yet and with comfort, bridging the distance in less than 2 days of actual walking. And they, mind you, wore only paper-thin boots of caribou skin on their feet. It is not that they are naturally impervious to discomfort, but simply that they have adjusted their physical reactions to meet the conditions they must face. They have bridged the barriers of their land, not by leveling them, as we would try to do, but by conforming to them. It is like the difference between a sailing vessel and one under power. When you compare an Ihalmuit and a white traveler in the Barrens. The white man, driven by his machine instincts, always lives at odds with his environment. Like a motor vessel, he bucks the winds and the seas, and he is successful only while the intricate apparatus built around him functions perfectly. But the Barrens people are an integral part of their environment. Like sailing ships, they learn to move with wind and water, to mold themselves to the rhythm of the elements, and so accomplish gently and without strain the things that must be done. By the time we were in sight of the little lakes, I was aware of a desperation not too far from madness. I cursed the land and the ephemeral dreams which had brought me to it. I cursed Franz and the poor dogs whose eyes were swollen almost shut by the constant assault of the insatiable flies. I was so tired that I did not greatly care whether or not I survived. If only those bloodthirsty legions of winged horrors would let me die in peace. On the last day, Franz was in the lead, followed by 3 dogs, while I trailed a half-mile behind, trying to force my dogs to efforts beyond their powers. I heard Franz call out when I looked ahead, and I saw 3 human figures where before there had been only 1. Franz stood on the crest of a ridge, and beside him were 2 other men, all 3 gesticulating and shouting at me down the slope. The sight of strangers seemed to offer some kind of hope, and I abandoned the plodding dogs and ran heavily up the hill, slipping and falling among the boulders. When I reached the crest, Franz and the other 2 men were sitting cross-legged on the rocks, and a little breeze was playing along the ridge to cool them off, and so to hold back the flies. One of the strangers was manipulating a little drill which looked rather like a bow and arrow, with the arrow pointed down into a piece of wood upon the ground, while the bow and its string, wound twice around the arrow's shank, was being pushed back and forth parallel to the ground. From the spinning tip of the drill rose a little curl of yellow smoke, and I realized that the fur-clad man was making fire. Our matches had long since been ruined when the top of the can in which they were carried came off during a river crossing. For 3 days we had had neither a smoke nor a mug of tea. 2 things that just barely made life endurable for a white man in the Barrens. Now I stood panting on the hill and watched an Eskimo casually producing fire as our distant ancestor had produced it in their time. The man looked up at me and smiled. A transfiguring smile which spread like a light of fire itself over his face. Franz motioned me to sit down while he got out the pail and the packet of sodden tea. Now the second Eskimo, a short and solid figure of a man, stepped forward, took the pail, and with a broad grin ran down to the slope to fetch us water from the tundra pool. Franz nodded his head after the water-getter. "Oh, Hoto," he said, "one of the best of them, and this one over there is Hiqua, the biggest hunter of the bunch." It was again a succinct introduction, typical of Franz. It was so brief because from his long contact with the people, he had come to see them with straight eyes and could not understand how weird and curious they would appear to me, who saw them with the oblique gaze of a man of civilized experience. However, if Franz could tell me no more than their names, I could at least appraise them for myself. Both were dressed in holiktuk, parkas, of autumn deerskin, with the fur side turned out. The parka of Hiqua, the firemaker, was decorated with insets of pure white fur about the shoulders and by a fringe of thin strips of hide around the bottom edge. Hohoto's was even more dressy, for it had a bead-embroidered neck and cuffs. But despite the beads and insets, the general appearance of both men was positively scruffy. Great patches of their hair were worn off the garments, and rents and tears had been imperfectly mended, evidently by an unpracticed hand. Food juices and fat drippings had matted the thick hair that remained, and dirt from unidentifiable sources had caked broad patches of the fur. Below these heavy parkas, which the 2 men were wearing next to their skins, were short fur trousers called kailik, and these were met above the knee by the yellow translucent tops of the skin boots. My first reaction as I saw and smelled these men was one of revulsion. They seemed foul to me, and I felt the instinctive surge of white man's ego as I wondered why the devil they couldn't find clean clothes to wear. That was, of course, the superficial thought of one who had no knowledge, but it typifies the conclusions drawn by most white men, particularly missionaries, when they view the savage in his abhorrent state of nature. But on that summer day in the Barrens, I wasn't so interested in dress as it may seem. My curious glance at the men's clothing was perfunctory, for I was fascinated by the men themselves. Hiqua, the bear, the others called him, was a mountain of a man, but a scaled-down mountain. His muscles bulged and flowed under the loose sleeves of his old parka, and the rhythm of the spinning fire drill was reflected in the pulse of tendons in his short and massive neck. Sweat beaded up steadily under his lank black hair. Then growing into drops, it rolled down the oblique slant of his low forehead, ran along the deep seams of his skin until it found an outlet, and, bypassing the broad planes about his half-hidden eyes, fell clear from the sprawling nostrils of his flattened nose. His broad and sensuous mouth, with its wide, swollen lips, worked in the same rhythm as the drill, and the half-dozen grizzled hairs that were his beard wagged to the same quick tempo. It was a parody of a face, a contorted parody which was meant for comedy, but which had a wild, essential quality that restrained my desire to laugh. There was a deep intelligence where one might expect to see only brute instinct, and there was humor and good nature that belied the weathered hide crinkling ape-like on the brow and on the flat plain cheeks. Hiqua removed the drill and shook a little pinch of smoldering ash from the fireboard onto a pile of dry and brittle moss. Then he knelt before it, and his cheeks swelled while his eyes disappeared altogether under their taut folds of skin. He blew, and the fire caught, giving birth to a minute, greenish flame. Ahoto returned with the water and with a great armful of green willow twigs, none bigger in circumference than a lead pencil. Franz took our precious tea stick from one of the dog's packs and jammed it into the moss so that the pail hung suspended from it over the tiny fire. And the day was so brilliant that the sun obscured the flames, and only a twist of smoke from the green wood showed that the water was slowly being brought to a boil. Now I had opportunity to see Ahoto. His was a young face, still rounded and without the creviced wrinkling of old Hikwa's. His hair had been roughly cut so that it hung like an uncouth tonsure of some pagan priest, and it was as coarse as the hair of the deer. The cut hair disclosed a high, broad forehead, and the eyes below it had not yet retreated into caves to escape the glare of winter snows. They were black and very bright, with the alert curiosity of a muskrat. Ahoto had an empty stone pipe clenched between his immense and regular white teeth, and I was not too slow to take the hint. I pulled out a bit of plug, damp and covered with debris, and when Ahoto saw it, he beamed broadly. Now I forget the discomforts and despair of the long trek. At last I was amongst the people, in the heart of their own land. And it was evident that at least some of my forebodings had been groundless. The tea pail boiled over, and the tiny fire hissed feebly and died. Franz flung a handful of leaves into the pot, and while they steeped, I relaxed on the fragile reindeer mosses below the crest of the high ridge. For the moment I was free of the blindness which had been mine while we had been forced to struggle so hard against the unmerciful antagonism of the land. I was free to look out over the summer plains, and for the first time to feel something of their beauty, and begin to understand the libel that is perpetrated by that name, the Barren Lands. In winter, perhaps, the name has validity, and at all times of the year it has validity for those whose minds have hardened over visions of great forests or neatly cultivated fields. Even after 2 years in the land, I too often have found myself using the word, and meaning it. Staring out over the limitless expanse, I at first saw only a rolling world of fading brown, shot through with streaks and whirls of yellow-greens, for when I tried to see it all, the individual colors merged into anonymity. It was a barren sight, and yet that desert face concealed a beauty that rose from 1,000 sources under the white sun. The deep chocolate bogs, laden with rich sepia dyes that stain the streams and pools, were bounded by white swales of emerald sedges and tall grass. On the sweeping slopes that rose above these verdant meadows, the dark and glossy greens of dwarf birch scrub formed amorphous patches of somber vitality that were illuminated by broad spaces where the brilliance of 10 million minute flowers drew to themselves small butterflies as gorgeous as any in the world. Even on the shattered ridges that are given over to the rocks, the creeping lichens suffused the gray stone with a wash of pastel tints, ranging from scarlet through the spectrum into velvet rosettes of perfect black. There was no lack of color rising from living things, but it is only that the eye beholds too much in this land that has no roof and no containing walls. The colors flow together and are lost in distance that the eye cannot embrace, and so we only see the barrenness that flows when beauty flows too thinly into the sponge of an illimitable space. These were the living colors that I saw upon the land, but there was much else to see as well. The lakes beneath us were quite uncountable, a meaningless jumble, looking like the shattered fragments of a great mirror. Between the shining shards of water were the little hills, low formless ridges whose slopes seen from the distance were gray-green with lichens, and whose crests were mottled with black rock. To the horizon on the north, the fading glint of lakelets caught the sun and glittered like dew upon brown grass. I knew that somewhere in that maze must lie the twisted course of the Inuit Ku, River of Men, but for the life of me I could not distinguish it in the aquatic puzzle spread out below. While I stared, Hoto came over and squatted on his hams beside me, also looking out over the land. His land. I lowered the glasses. He grinned again, and in the grand manner of a small townsman showing his city friends the sights, he began to point out the things of interest. It did not matter that he could not speak my language, nor I his. Ahoto had the power of expression without words. There was a directness that made his gesticulation seem as clear as printed English. Now he stretched his arm toward a rather large lake that lay only a few miles to the north and said, "Utek Kumanik." Looking with my glasses, I could see 3 little grayish pimples by the shores of Utek's lake, and as I strained my eyes, I could also see a fine thread of smoke. The tents of the people. Rapidly, Ahoto swung his arm to the north and pointed out the other lakes, Halo Kumanik, Kakumi Kumanik, and lastly, Tingmea Ku, the little goose river that leads the lakes into the great current of the Inuit Ku itself. But I could still make nothing of Inuit Ku. It seemed to be only a string of lakes, set amongst countless other lakes, and lacking all the continuity of a great river. Later, when I traveled on it, I was to marvel at its clear-cut shape and its directness, but seen from a distance, it simply blended into the watery chaos and disappeared. It became part of the chameleon shape of the Barrens show. The chameleon shape the Barrens show to all outsiders. We drank our tea on the crest of the hill, then packed up and started down into the Ihalmuit land. The 2 Eskimos led the way, and their bounding agility over the rough rocks would have put a caribou to shame. We followed painfully a long way behind, and at last came to the low shores of Utek's lake. Trying to think of the word. What's that word for aggressive, like city running? I can't think of it, but it's like their town, their city, and there's probably some similarity to that kind of marvelous balletic traversal of complicated expanse. Across the water we could clearly see the 3 tents, blending so well into the weathered gravel ridge behind that they might have grown from the hills. People and dogs were running aimlessly about amongst the tents, and 2 new fires had been lighted, for the distant vision of the people had shown them that strangers were approaching, and it is mandatory that all strangers must be fed as soon as they arrive. I was to learn later that the camps of the people were arranged in little groups of 2 or 3 tents on the shores of several lakes, for there was not enough willow scrub in the land to support the cooking fires of more than 3 families at any single spot. Here at Utek Kumanik, where the tents of Hikwa, Utek, and Ohoto, and a few miles eastward on Halo Kumanik, were the 3 tents of Halo, Yaha, and Miki. On Kakumi Kumanik, there were 3 separate camps, Katelo and Elekahau, having their tents at one spot. Auliktuk and Onekwa had a second, while the 2 tents of Old Kakumi stood alone on the far side of the lake. Thus, within a radius of 3 miles of each other, dwelt all the living people in the land, which stretched for 500 miles from south to north and 300 miles from east to west. It was the most ancient camp of the Ihalmuit, and it was also the last. And I was the first outlander to come upon it in all the centuries that tents had stood beside the little lakes. Yet if that thought filled me with excitement, the prospect of meeting white man for the first time in their lives was filling the women and children from the tents ahead with equal excitement. We rounded the lake and came up toward the camp. Here the foreshore sloping to the lake was not composed of rocks, but almost exclusively of bones. This was an ancient site, and the piles of whitened caribou bones had mounted with the years until they had reached staggering proportions. For in the Barrens neither wood nor bone ever seems to rot or pass away. Dogs in the weather had broken up the larger pieces of bone and spread them evenly around until they formed a pavement all about the camp, but neither dogs nor weather had greatly affected the skulls, and these, with their huge antlers, formed a dead forest of white snags. Later on, I counted over 200 skulls within 100 yards of an Ihalmuit tent, and these represented only a fraction of the total number of beasts whose remains lay in that place, for only the heads of kills made close at hand are ever brought to camp. The 3 tents stood on the sloping ledge where they would catch whatever breeze might blow, for the breeze serves as a sole protection from the flies. Near each tent was a rough stone hearth, and beside each fire a tremendous mound of willow twigs. They were, of course, quite green. These were, of course, quite green, and the little fires were giving out great rolling coils of smoke. On the nearest fireplace was a huge iron pot, ridiculously like the pots that cannibals seem to favor in our magazine cartoons. As for the tents themselves, each was a cone about 15 feet in diameter at its base and perhaps 10 feet high. They were a patchwork affair, composed of roughly scraped deer hides hung on a wooden frame. The hides had been stitched together while they were still green, and as they dried, the seams had pulled apart so that the broad cracks outlined the position of each hide. Around the bottom of the tent, a ring of boulders acted as an anchor. In that land you do not drive wooden pegs, even if you have them, for if the rocks did not prevent you, then the perpetual frost, which often lies only a few inches below the surface of the ground, would shatter the peg before it got a grip. The doorways faced the north, the direction from which the returning deer would come. The doors themselves were made of single hides, untanned and dried to the hardness of wood. In a way, the Ihalmuit camp seemed only to accentuate the apparent desolation and emptiness of the Arctic plains. And yet in the immediate vicinity of the tents was this little pocket of life in the center of the human vacuum that otherwise possessed the Barrens. We felt that we could breathe easily here, for we were no longer entirely alone, though I was still a little afraid of our reception. It was a foolish fear. Hikwa and Hoto had run on ahead, shouting loudly as they went, but their warning was superfluous, for every man, woman, and child was out about the fires, driven to a kind of ecstatic fury by the approach of strangers. One old woman, bent and beaten as if by the rocks of the land, frenziedly blew at the coals of a fire and heaped fresh twigs upon it until she smothered it completely. Utek's wife, Ihalmuit, was wrestling with the hindquarters of a deer, still dripping wet, which she had hauled out of the cold storage of the frigid lake for supper. Between snatching furtive glances at us and trying to cut off chunks of meat with her curved ulu, or a woman's knife, she was in imminent danger of slicing off her fingers, too. Her wooden hair ornaments swung and jumped like live things as she hurried, and her child, Kalek, who lived in the back of her parka, screamed with pleasure as he batted at her flying braids. Even the dogs caught the excitement. 3 pups simultaneously began to chase their tails, while a pair of older dogs joined noisy battle. Children hustled among the dogs, kicking them lightly in their exposed bellies, either to drive them off or just to have something to do as we approached. Franz and I stopped about 100 yards short of the nearest tent, and the 3 men, Utek, Hikwa, and Ahoto, came out to welcome us, formally, into their homes. Ahoto and Hikwa acted as if they were meeting us for the first time. They were very correct and very solemn as they gravely touched our fingertips. Then, with the formal greeting over, Utek produced a stone pipe loaded with atamojak, the dried leaves of a low, bushy plant which make an inadequate substitute for tobacco, and offered me a smoke. Together we walked to Utek's tent while the women and children ceased their frenetic labors and watched us with unconcealed anticipation. We had been welcomed formally, so that it was now good manners to give way to curiosity, a thing one must not do until a visitor is settled, lest you embarrass him thereby. All the children, women and old people from the entire camp crowded closely into Utek's tent behind us, and collectively they produced an overpowering odor, which, however, was cancelled out by the obvious good nature and good feeling which also emanated from these people. Utek bade us sit down on the sleeping platform, and while his wife was organizing the other women in preparation for a feast, I had a good look at this home of the Ihalmuit. The tent was not even vaguely weather-tight. Great streaks of sky showed along the joints between the skins. Under those portions of the tent, which were more or less whole, were the belongings of the family, and these possessions were simple almost to the point of non-existence. Strange to think of possessions like that. It's certainly not the way we live. Along one half of the enclosed circle was the low sleeping bench of willow twigs and lichens, covered with a haphazard mattress of tan deer hides. This was the communal bed where the entire family slept together under a robe or two of softened skins. The rest of the floor space was given over to an amazing litter of half-eaten, ready-to-be-eaten, and never-to-be-eaten bits of caribou. I saw an entire boiled head that had been pretty well chewed over, and a pile of leg bones which had been cracked for marrow and then boiled to extract the last precious drop of oil. On one side of the tent was a more or less complete brisket, with skin attached, of a deer that obviously should have been eaten long ago. Later I discovered this was a sort of snack bar where hungry visitors could slice off a bit of raw but well tenderized meat while waiting for mealtime. Around the inner surface of the tent, suspended from a dozen precious poles, were the odd bits of clothing not required for the moment. A few pairs of kamick, stiff and dry and half-transparent, waited for their owner's feet. There, nearby, lay a couple of inner parkas called atiji, and some children's overalls that are one-piece garments of fawn hide. Pushed under one pole was a huge wad of dried sphagnum moss waiting the needs of the young child Calic, for diapers are not used in the Barrens, where nature has provided a more efficient sponge. And that about completed the furnishings of Utek's tent, except for an ancient wooden chest where held the treasures of the family, the amulet belt of Utek, the sewing kit of Halmik, and with its bone needles and hank of caribou sinew thread, half a dozen empty 44 by 40 brass cartridge cases which someday might ornament the bowls of stone pipes, a bow drill, a muskox horn comb, and some children's toys. While I was getting my bearings, Franz produced a plug of trade tobacco, which is nearly as vile as the Ihalmuit product, and it went the rounds. I noticed with great interest that Utek, after filling his pipe with the precious stuff, passed it to his wife so that she might have the first smoke. In fact, she smoked most of it before returning it to Utek. A small gesture this, but one that I was to find was typical of the consideration and affection with which the Ihalmuit men treated their wives. There was a tremendous amount of talk while we sat about the tent waiting for supper, most of it between Franz and the three Eskimo men, while the rest listened avidly and interjected comments and bursts of laughter. Franz translated a little of what was being said, and the conversation was, as always, mostly about the deer. Where were they? Had we seen any fresh tracks? How long did we think it would be before Tuktu, the deer, came from the north? It was an engrossing subject, and I wanted to be in on it, but only by begging Franz to tell me what was going on could I get the gist at all. I began to get bored after a while, feeling left out, for Franz was soon too interested to waste time translating for me. To occupy myself, I got out my notebook and began to idly sketch a caribou. The talk rose and fell about me, and with no conscious thought, I sketched a pipe into my caribou's mouth, and gave the beast a self-satisfied human leer. I had not realized that I was being closely watched. Hikwa, who sat a little behind me, had been peering intently over my shoulder. At first he was baffled, but suddenly the full humor of a caribou that smoked a pipe struck him with the force of a physical blow. Before I knew what was happening, he had rolled off the bench, quite literally, and was in the grip of a first-class attack of hysterics. Startled, I thought he had gone mad or had had a seizure, but both Franz and I jumped to our feet in real consternation. The little notebook fell face upward and on the floor, where it was pounced on by Ohota, who took one quick look and burst into wild guffaws. The book was snatched from his hand and passed around the circle of eager faces, and with the rapidity of chain lightning the laughter spread and grew wilder until it engulfed the tent in one insane pandemonium. Very slowly it dawned on me that this was neither a war dance nor a mass attack of zaniness, but a tribute to my wit. I grinned self-consciously at those about me who were shrieking and weeping with completely uninhibited mirth. Then I rescued my book, which was about to disappear out the door into the hands of one of the howling small child. I looked at my drawing. Oddly enough, it struck me, too, as being hilariously funny. And with no regard for propriety, I began to bellow with laughter at my own feeble joke. The thing was now quite out of control. Hikwa had a choking fit, and someone hauled him outside for treatment. One old crone lost her balance and fell against the tent. The taut skin burst with a great boom, and she sprawled, still shrieking like a demented thing on the sharp rocks outside. I began to worry. Really, I knew I couldn't have been as funny as all that, but mass hysteria had seized the people, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it. Nothing, that is, except food. Ihalmuit appeared in the doorway, looking properly curious, and bearing a big wooden tray heaped high with steaming chunks of deer meat. The steam struck the roisterers as if by magic, the rich aroma quelled their mirth. Hikwa, still a little shaky, came back into the tent, followed by the old woman. And everyone sat down and stared expectantly at the meat tray.